But then I realized that looking at the functional genomics allowed you to what we call look under the hood, see what's really going on. And the genesis of it, when I just started looking at homocysteine, and homocysteine, if it's too high, creates sooner death from all causes. When somebody says this is the diet that's good for everybody, run, because there isn't one. There's scientific evidence that continual exposure to EMF causes superoxide inside the body. Back in the early days of mining, the miners would take a canary along with them. And what they would do is they would watch the canary, because the canary had very small lungs. And if the oxygen would start dropping, the canary would fall over dead. Or they better get out or they'll be next. And that's where that canary in the coal mine story came from. We are seeing many people that are now the canary in the coal mines today that, you run into people all the time. They can't be around someone with perfume. They can't even go down the aisle of the grocery store. So if somebody has genetic weakness in their detox pathways, they're going to be that canary in the coal mine.
Welcome to the Live Damn Well podcast. My name is Jorge Roman, and my guest today is Bob Miller, a traditional naturopath specializing in the field of genetic-specific nutrition. He earned his traditional naturopathic degree from Trinity School of Natural Health and is board certified through the ANMA. In 1993, he opened the Tree of Life practice, and he has served as a traditional naturopath for 27 years. And for the past several years, he has been engaged exclusively with functional, nutritional, genetic variants, and related research, specializing in nutritional support for those with chronic Lyme disease. Bob, thank you for joining me.
Oh, my pleasure. We're going to have a lot of fun today.
Yeah, I think so. We're going to be talking a lot about, inflammation, oxidative stress, nutrigenetics, which is really something I'm very excited to talk about because that's how I really nutrition was how I launched into the health space in general. That's where I began as an athlete several years ago. So I'm very excited to talk about this. It's an emerging field. And yeah, so first, tell me about the work that you're doing at the Nutrigenetic Institute, the Tree of Life, and for the listeners who aren't aware of genetic specific nutrition.
Sure. Well, it was maybe about 15 years ago that I started looking at, the way people are healing, the way they're getting well. And, in traditional naturopathy, we do things typically for, anti-inflammatory or support digestion, all those kind of things. But then I realized that looking at the functional genomics allowed you to what we call look under the hood, see what's really going on. And the genesis of it, when I just started looking at homocysteine, and homocysteine, if it's too high, uh, you know, creates sooner death from all causes. So I started looking at that, and then realized there's these things called the enzymes that are controlled by our genetics, and I just fell in love with it. It was just so fascinating. So back then, 23andMe, gave us a really good genetic report. And what I did is I just created a spreadsheet, just an Excel spreadsheet, where we downloaded 23andMe, and I started putting logic in there that said, let's sort by these enzymes, and then I'd plug in the different enzymes, and it was, very crude when I look back at it at that time. Then many doctors became quite interested in that, and they're like, well, can we have that spreadsheet? And and then from there was so much demand that I decided, well, we can't just be constantly sharing a spreadsheet. I mean, it was really crude. I mean, it's kind of like the old Model A Ford or something like that. So then I worked with a computer company, and we made our own cloud-based software so that the 23andMe data could be uploaded. Things were going along quite well until 23andMe came out with their next version of genetic testing. And of course, they made improvements for them, which would be related to better ancestry and more data. But it really dropped a lot of the functional genomics we were looking at. So as a result of that, then I decided, well, if I want to really be looking at functional genomics quite well and nutrigenomics, then I need to have my own chip. So then I created my own genetic chip that now doctors use. So we have software that doctors across the world use. Uh, not for looking at disease, but for looking at things like nutrigenomics and functional genomics. So I've been at it now for a good 15 years, having a blast, and we think we're on the cutting edge of looking at what we call functional genomics, and we can get into that just a bit as we move along. So that's some of the history.
Yeah, very interesting. So just curious, how did 23andMe change the way that they do things, which made it kind of more difficult for you?
Well, there's millions of what are called SNPs, and we can get into that. And they on their version 3 and 4, had many of the SNPs that were related to function. And of course, they give you ancestry information. So I can't say for sure, but I think they wanted more genes related to ancestry, and perhaps for some other reasons. So they just pushed some aside that wasn't of interest to them, which is fine. But it was of interest to those of us who wanted to look at function. So that's why I
Gotcha.
made my own chip, where I put back a lot of the things that were removed from that. And then there's concerns for security and safety and all of that. It's probably a good move because there is some concerns of data being shared. And of course, we never share anyone's data in our, we don't sell it to anybody. We don't share it with anybody. The computer company we work with actually does work for the U.S. Navy, where security is just utmost. So we probably have more security on someone's genetic data than probably anybody else does because of who we work with.
Amazing. Yeah, so that was a perfect segue because I do want to talk about SNPs or single nucleotide polymorphisms next. So tell me about them and their role in genetic specific nutrition.
Sure. Well, firstly, let me back up a step. As we know, we're all made out of cells, and inside those cells are something called the mitochondria, the mighty mitochondria, as they sometimes call it. And what a miracle we are. We eat fats, carbohydrates, proteins. We drink water, we breathe air, and we're exposed to sunlight, and everything gets made. I mean, the more I step back and just think about it, it's like, wow, how does it do that? How does that happen? So that happens because something called enzymes will take one substance and they'll pull that substance in, and they'll pull something else in, or maybe two things, and with the cofactor they'll make something new. Then another enzyme comes along and says, okay, I'll take this end product, combine it with something else, and make something new. So that's how those fats, carbs, proteins, water, air, and sunlight become everything inside the body. I mean, to me, it's just mind boggling how that works. Your hair, your skin, your nails, your neurotransmitters, your red blood cells, they all get manufactured by the body. And that's those enzymes. Now, the reason I started there was because your DNA is the instructions on how to make the enzymes. And I'm sure everyone's seen DNA that looks like a ladder that twists. Okay. And that ladder that twists, on the one side, you get what's called a nucleotide from mother, the other side, nucleotide from father. So at the moment you were conceived, when that sperm and egg went together, boom, your genetic pattern was made. Doesn't change. And 50 years after you're gone, if there's tissue left and someone measures it, it's going to be the same. Now, people argue that the expression of the genes are affected by environmental factors and cofactors. Yeah, yes, but that actual blueprint of how your body makes the enzymes never changes. So these nucleotides, interestingly, there's only 4 of them, and they're abbreviated A, C, T, and G. Now, let's go back to those enzymes. Enzymes take one thing, make it to another. If that enzyme's not working at 100%, that enzyme is not going to take that one substance as effectively and take it into the next. So we call that, when we have an enzyme deficiency, a SNP, single nucleotide polymorphism, or sometimes it's called a mutation or a defect. I don't like to use those words. Nobody's mutated or defective. But what happens is, we get a swap. There's only 4 of them. They're called A, C, T, and G. And for each enzyme, one of them is ideal and another one may not be as efficient. So when we get these mutations or SNPs, the enzyme may be working at 70% or 50%, rather than 100%. Now, interestingly, people say, well, how did we get those? Well, there is some thought that sometimes accidents occur. That there is some thought that during the 1200s, when when syphilis and gonorrhea and those sexually transmitted diseases were rampant, that's when some of these mutations occurred. But interestingly, some mutations are actually helpful. For example, people of English and Irish descent, they often have genetic mutations that they absorb a little bit more iron from their diets. And I'm sure people have heard of hemochromatosis. That's when it's severe. Uh, but mild versions of that occur quite often in the English and Irish. And what it goes back to, the reason the Irish came to America was because of the potato famines. And during the potato famines, if you happen to have a genetic mutation that you absorb more iron, that was to your advantage. So the women who had that mutation were more likely to have babies. So by natural selection, those people absorb more iron.
So it conferred an advantage.
Yes, during times of famine, that's a good thing.
Right.
Come to America, we don't have too much famine. Many foods are fortified with iron, and we can actually then get too much iron. And we can talk about that later when we talk about inflammation. But the cliff note is that if iron is in excess and not carried around properly, it's one of the nastiest free radicals there is. Uh, if we don't have iron, we don't have hemoglobin, life doesn't exist. But excess iron or iron not being carried around properly is very inflammatory. Another one is G6PD mutations. G6PD is involved with making something called NADPH that recycles your antioxidants. However, uh, G6PD mutations protect you from malaria. So, particularly in Africa and in Native Americans, this G6PD mutation actually protected you from malaria. Now, however, that really puts you at a disadvantage when you're dealing with a lot of inflammation. Well, in Africa or when people are Native Americans, they didn't have that many things that created inflammation. So it was to your advantage. Today, uh, G6PD mutations really put you at a distinct disadvantage because you don't recycle your antioxidants. And clearly, perhaps we can get into this, we're living in a world today vastly different from just 50 years ago. All of the environmental things, and we can tick those off very quickly. Because I think someday we're going to look back and say, what in the heck were we thinking? Okay. Number one, giving the animals growth hormones so they get fatter faster. Oh my gosh. Yes, you're going to make more money because the animal is going to get fatter faster. But as we eat that meat, we get those growth hormones that can be inflammatory. Plastics. When I was a kid, our milk came in glass jars. Well, we became modernized, and who wants to mess with washing your glass? So let's put it in plastic, and we can just throw it away. Where I'm in Pennsylvania, a study was done. You cannot find one waterway in Pennsylvania now that doesn't have microplastic particles in it. Those plastics are xenoestrogens. Male frogs are getting ovaries. Male fish are getting ovaries. Uh, and anybody who's, probably over 50 years old knows that girls today at 12 are much more mature than they were 50 years ago at 12 because of the estrogen driving the breast development and other things. Boys' sperm rates are dropping. Boys' testosterone is dropping. Then the other one we're going to look back on, I believe, is glyphosate. Interesting story on glyphosate. It was actually, I believe it was a metal chelator. I'm not exactly sure, but it had something to do with taking metal particles off. That may not be quite correct, but it wasn't designed as something that kills weeds. The story goes that it actually got spilled on some weeds, and they saw that it killed the weeds. So it's like, we've got a weed killer here. So all across the world, we're putting glyphosate on the crops. And, many people who tried to warn us about glyphosate were just silenced and ridiculed. And now you're seeing ads on in media. If you were exposed to glyphosate and have various cancers, so glyphosate seems to be impacting us in various ways. Then we genetically modify our foods. Then we're exposed to all of our volatile organic compounds. Mold appears to be getting stronger. And the one that a lot of people are surprised by, that more and more evidence is coming out, and that is that our cell phones and Wi-Fi, uh, there's scientific evidence that continual exposure to EMF causes superoxide inside the body, and that's a nasty free radical. So we've done a lot that we're going to look back. Oh, the other one is I'm glad to see that you have wired earbuds on, because when people have these wireless, we're going to look back someday and say, what were we thinking?
We're just getting
Putting,
bombarded with radiation.
yeah, putting radio transmitters basically inside our heads. Seriously? We're going to look back on that and say, oh my God, what were we thinking?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So the bottom line is we are just bombarding ourselves with environmental toxins. And I don't know if you know the story of, back in the early days of mining, the miners would take a canary along with them. And what they would do is they would watch the canary, because the canary had very small lungs. And if the oxygen would start dropping, and I think it was CO2 or something else going up, the canary would fall over dead. So they knew that they better get out next, or they better get out or they'll be next. And that's where that canary in the coal mine story came from. So we are seeing many people that are now the canary in the coal mines today, that, you run into people all the time. They can't be around someone with perfume. Cigarettes make them sick. They can't even go down the aisle of the grocery store. Everything bothers them. I just saw a report that the older millennials, those that are 36 to 40, as a group, they are now sicker than any other time in history for that age group. Autoimmune disease, chronic illness, and when I was a kid, we used to call it adult onset diabetes. Now, 6 and 8 year old kids are getting diabetes. So autoimmune and diseases are going up rapidly, despite many improvements in medical care. But I believe it's related to environmental toxicity. And those who have functional weakness. So if anybody's wondering why I'm going down that rabbit hole, it's going back to functional weakness. So if somebody has genetic weakness in their detox pathways, they're going to be that canary in the coal mine that gets sicker from mold. I see this all the time. Two people live in the same house. One person is sick as can be from the mold, and the other person says, "You're imagining things. I don't feel a thing. This must be in your head." But the problem is the one person has good detox capacity, the other one doesn't. So that's how our genetics impact us. Because when we get those SNPs that impact how we might make more inflammation, and we can go over that, or how we might make less than optimal antioxidants, then that just sets us up for an inflammatory condition. The changes, the traditional naturopath talked about the internal terrain or the milieu, the internal environment of the body. If we go back in history, Antoine Béchamp is the guy who said it's the environment of the body that creates illness. And another scientist said, no, it's the virus or the bacteria. Well, it's both. So when you have the virus or the bacteria, for some people they'll fight it off, other people they don't. So there was this scientific argument between the environment and the pathogen, and the bottom line is they were both correct. We didn't
This
need
is
to argue.
terrain versus germ theory, right?
Yes, the germ theory. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that was a very comprehensive introduction. I think that really laid the foundation for what we're going to get into. So, going from oxidative stress. Let's talk about that, because on your website you explain that there's an imbalance of, that an imbalance of free radicals and oxidative stress may be at the root of, many chronic diseases. So, how do you go about identifying this and then subsequently reversing it?
Sure. Well, let's first talk about oxidative stress. Everything's made out of atoms. So you got the neutron, proton, and the electron that spins. And that needs to be electrically balanced. If an electron gets ripped off, that's called a free radical. And that atom doesn't like being that way. So it will happily steal from its neighbor and then so doing do tissue damage. So when you've got inflammation, for the most part, you've got free radicals called reactive oxygen species. Antioxidants have a spare electron. So one of the major antioxidants is called glutathione. And glutathione is made from 3 amino acids, and your body makes that. So you can have genetic defects that you don't make enough glutathione. You can have genetic weakness that you don't recycle your glutathione. So after glutathione donates an electron, it's oxidized. So we need to put an electron back on there. Earlier, I talked about the G6PD mutation. That limits your NADPH that puts that electron back on there. So you need to make glutathione, which is made from cysteine, glycine, and glutamate. You need to use it properly to take toxins out and neutralize free radicals, and you need to recycle it. Interestingly, we do, as you mentioned, we do studies on Lyme disease. We've done 8 of them. We're working on our 9th right now. We're recording this Memorial Day weekend, and this weekend I'm going to be writing my abstract to present to ILADS, where we're actually finding those with chronic Lyme, those who, let's back up. Some people get bit by a tick and their body fights it off. Others do 1 round of antibiotics and they're fine. And then there's other people that are struggling for years, and they're seeing the best Lyme doctors and they're getting the best antibiotics and the binders and everything else. They can't seem to get over it. Those are the ones we're studying. And we'll be possibly presenting this at the ILADS in September, that those who have this chronic condition many times don't effectively recycle their oxidized glutathione to the reduced. And we have the Nutrigenomics Research Institute that looks at these things, and that's who will be presenting this data. And we're finding those people that are really struggling are the ones that oftentimes don't take their oxidized glutathione back to the reduced. So that's the antioxidant side of it. So, and there's antioxidants like catalase. And again, you can have genetic mutations that you don't make enough catalase. One of the ones that we're really researching right now is superoxide dismutase. I'm very intrigued by that. And we can talk about some of the genetic mutations that allow you to make not enough of that. So you can have a genetic predisposition that you don't make enough antioxidants. Now, on the other hand, you can have genetic mutations that you make too many free radicals. And if you'd like, we can zip through the free radical producers, then we'll go through the antioxidants. And so one of my things that I'm trying to get across as we train doctors, because we train physicians in nutrigenomics, I think we've got to get away from the pill for the ill. That if you have this condition, do this. Because that kind of sort of works, but not always. So for some people who have an inflammatory condition, they might be overproducing free radicals. For another person, they may be underproducing antioxidants. For the sickest of the sick, they've got both. They're overproducing free radicals, underproducing antioxidants. So, do you want to go through all the things that can create more free radicals?
Before we get into that, I wanted to ask you, how common are, some of those SNPs? Like, for example, let's take the not making enough antioxidants. How common is that?
Well, I have a very unique database, and that is, I mostly get referrals by physicians who say, Bob, you're not a physician, but you're looking at these genomics. Help me with this patient because I'm stuck. So we see that's my common database. So in my world, it's just about everybody. Now, how that relates to the population, I'm not sure. In our software, we want to do some comparisons to our data versus the common themes in population, but I've got a skewed database. So the people I look at, this is very common.
Okay. And for those people, what are some of the symptoms that they have?
Well, these are the people that have inflammation that nobody seems to get under control.
Okay.
They've gone to their physicians, they've gone to naturopaths, they've gone to acupuncturists, they've gone to herbalists, they've been to the top places, and they're just so inflamed. Their C-reactive protein might be high, or the complement A might be high, or they've just got fatigue. They can't get out of bed, and many times these people have Lyme disease and mold exposure, and we'll get a little bit into IL-6 maybe after we get through some of these other things. But and you know, painkillers take away the pain, anti-inflammatories help a little bit, but they're not getting to the root cause. And they're spending tens of thousands of dollars and getting nowhere. So I have functional medicine doctors that, schedule appointments with me all the time, say, Bob, let's talk about this person. Sometimes it'll just be me and the physician. Sometimes it'll be me and the patient and the physician. And then this is what we try to identify.
Interesting. It's interesting. So these SNPs then, if your mom or your dad or your sister, your brother don't react to something like mold as much, or, electromagnetic fields as much, it may be because they have some sort of SNP that gives them a sort of deficiency. Is that right?
You're saying for the people who don't react?
Yes.
Okay. Well, let's first talk about how we inherit our genomics. Okay. So let's say, so the mother and father pass on your genetics. So you get 50% from mother, 50% from father. And let's say, for example, the mother has one defect on an enzyme and the father has one as well. So they could have one child who doesn't have any mutations at all because they got the two good ones from mother and father. 25% chance of that. 50% chance that one of the parents will give them one and they'll be like the mother and father. Or there's a 25% chance that the mother and father both give it and the child gets what's called homozygous, or two mutations. So if mother and father have one defect on the same enzyme, you could have three kids, one that has none, no defects, one that has one, and one that has two. So
Okay.
just earlier today, I was talking to a mother and her daughter, and I've seen the mother, the daughter, and the son, and we were comparing. It's like, oh yeah, the son didn't get this one, but the daughter did. But on the other hand, vice versa, things get passed on differently. So that's why children of the same two parents can have completely unique genetics based upon what the parents passes on. Now, if any parent has what's called a homozygous, or they inherit from both mother and father, no matter how many children they have, each child will get one from that parent.
Interesting. Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
So, like if one parent has homozygous and the other person doesn't have any mutations, well, every child's going to have one. So, if both parents, though, are homozygous, meaning both have, then every child will have homozygous as well.
Okay. And this will, influence their levels of inflammation.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yep. All right.
Gotcha.
Well, let's start zipping through what causes inflammation. I alluded to this a little bit earlier, and that is iron. So, without iron, we don't have hemoglobin, we don't carry our oxygen, life doesn't exist. However, as I mentioned earlier, among the English and the Irish, and especially among Ashkenazi Jews, they have genetic mutations that they'll absorb more iron. Now, you can have what are called the heterozygous just from one parent, and the literature shows that you'll absorb a little bit more iron under those conditions. It's when you got those homozygous, that's when you get hemochromatosis, where the iron is so high, it can damage the liver and the organs, and the only solution is to do blood donation. Just either donate blood or do phlebotomy and just get rid of it. So it's not just over absorbing iron. And one of my things that I think we're going to evolve into is people are looking to put SNPs or mutations with disease. So what happens is, say, for example, breast cancer or dementia, they take that group of people, they look at their genome, and it's like, oh, people with breast cancer have more mutations in the BRCA genes. and therefore that's tied to breast cancer. Well, that's true. But I think just to have that one mutation is an oversimplification. Now, this is just Bob Miller opinion. That's all this is. But I think what you'll find is probably a lot of women have the BRCA gene, never get breast cancer. Then some women who have it do. My hypothesis would be it's multiple factors. You live in a moldy house, you had Lyme disease. Maybe you live next to a farm and your water had glyphosate in it. You also had difficulty making your antioxidants. Maybe you had an imbalance of your hormones. Boom, breast cancer. I like to say it's the 3D chess game played underwater. Multiple factors going together. That I don't think, I think the days of saying this SNP is related to that. For example, I have one of the dementia genes. I'm 66 and I think my brain's doing okay. So, but I really work at it. Okay. I take a lot of antioxidants, and probably if I didn't, I'd probably be having a little bit of memory loss at this point. But I think my brain's pretty sharp, but I work at it. I have air filters in my office. I sleep in a sleeping bag that protects me from EMF. I take a lot of antioxidants and those kind of things. I make sure I'm digesting my fats properly, because I still like to be doing this at around 83 to 84 years old. So we'll see.
That's awesome. Yeah, no.
Yeah.
So what I'm hearing you say, really, it's a really interesting point to emphasize, which is that it's not only genetics, as I think there are some people who really place an emphasis on just genetics. And I think, like you said in the beginning, the pharmaceutical model that we have with allopathic medicine really does tend to focus on genetics, which is why, you're popping pills essentially. But it's not only that, but it's also not only your environment, right? It's that interaction, that 3D chess game that you're talking about.
Sure. There's an old saying that genetics loads the gun, environment pulls the trigger. And a lot of the people that are ill today, well, let's say, for example, let's look at autism. Our genetics haven't changed. There's nobody running around differently today than there was 50 years ago. Why is autism skyrocketing? Why is diabetes skyrocketing? So I do notice in talking to parents of autistic children, they have genetic patterns that may lead to more glutamate and more histamine. But I would pretend that 50 years ago it wouldn't have mattered. That autistic child today would likely be rambunctious or, excitable, high spirited, but likely not autistic. I mean, why else would autism rates be skyrocketing? Yes, they say it's a genetic, and I agree, but I think 50 years, even for myself, uh, based on my genome, I think if I would have been born 10 years ago, I'd probably be autistic.
I think there's also a few researchers that I've heard that talk about how the testing and the criteria for autism has also evolved now. So they're maybe getting better at identifying it. Not sure how true that is, but that's what I've
Well,
heard.
probably, I mean, that's probably a factor,
Right.
but I don't think anybody could argue that there's not more autism and ADD today than there was 50 years ago. I mean, when I talk to elementary school teachers, I'll say, tell me about the students today versus 5 years ago. All of them tell me, we're not talking about autism, more restless, can't focus, more irritable in just 5 years. And every teacher I've talked to tells me that.
Yeah, I've heard the same exact thing. I mean, even from, I think it probably started when I was in elementary school, but even then I've talked to several teachers and they tell me the same things. I mean, it's just insane. And there's actually one specific elementary school teacher that I've talked to who's also kind of involved with, electromagnetic field research. And she tells me the same thing. I mean, that's heavily linked to ADHD, not just because of the psychological factor, but because of the physiological factor on the nervous system. Today, I want to interrupt the show to highlight Thrive Market. Now, Thrive Market is on a mission to make healthy living accessible and affordable for as many people as possible. It's a fully online, subscription-based grocery store which provides a free membership to a low-income family, teacher, or veteran in need for every single paid membership. Now, let me tell you why I think Thrive Market is really changing the game in the world of health-promoting foods. First of all, you can shop hand-picked brands from cosmetics to supplements to even frozen wild-caught fish, grass-fed beef, and a bunch of other household products, which are all shipped right to your door. And you might think to yourself, well, organic health food is so expensive. And I totally agree, but when you buy from Thrive Market, you actually save around 25 to 50% off the retail price that you'd find in a physical health food store near you. And the membership is incredibly affordable. It's really just about the price of a cup of coffee per month. And on average, the members make it back in savings after just 2 orders. It's also way easier than the grocery store. They make it so easy to shop. It's all online and ships right to your door, and you can sort the entire catalog by non-GMO, organic, vegan, gluten-free, paleo, sustainably farmed. Personally, my family has been ordering for Thrive Market for several years, and we really can't recommend it enough. So if you want to make eating healthier not only more affordable, but convenient and delicious, try Thrive Market risk-free for a month. Using my link, I get a commission, but you also get a discount, so it's a win-win. And you'll get a gift of up to $24 in value when you use the link. And if you don't like it, no worries, you'll get a refund of your membership. The link is in the description. Hope you give them a try. Now back to the show.
Absolutely. I mean, you can find published literature, not just some, tin hat running around saying something, that EMF increases superoxide free radical. I mean, the experiments were done. This isn't theory. This isn't speculation. EMF increases superoxide. And this isn't I believe in it or don't believe in it. It does create more superoxide. And that will create more inflammation inside the body.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And for anyone who wants to go more in depth into that, the Environmental Health Trust is an amazing resource for that. They have a lot of peer-reviewed scientific research published on their website, and yeah, I would recommend anyone who's interested in that go check it out, because there are literally thousands of studies. So we talked a little bit about iron, but what else contributes to inflammation and obviously EMFs?
Let me go down the iron pathway just a little bit more.
Okay.
So if you got too much iron, what will happen is that when we're making energy inside the cells, sometimes an electron flies off, combines with oxygen, and makes something called superoxide. We talked about that. Then superoxide dismutase, the antioxidant, turns that into hydrogen peroxide. And that's that same thing that you put on a cut, hydrogen peroxide. The body then makes catalase, uses glutathione and something called thioredoxin to turn that hydrogen peroxide into water. If that doesn't happen, that iron in what's called the Fenton reaction, discovered in 1895 by Dr. Fenton, will turn into what are called hydroxyl radicals that are very pro-inflammatory and will create all kinds of inflammation throughout the body. So it goes back to so the people that really struggle with this may have a genetic predisposition to overabsorb iron, and then maybe they cook in iron skillets. And if you want to be entertained or disgusted sometime, just go on YouTube and Google iron filings in cereal. And it will show where somebody takes a box of cereal, grinds it into a powder, mixes it with water, holds a magnet, and pieces of metal come up. There's your fortified cereal. Cool. So if you have excess iron and you don't clear your hydrogen peroxide, Fenton reaction occurs and you got hydroxyl radicals. One of the most common things I see with people who have high levels of inflammation. So what do? Sometimes you have to do some things that slow down the absorption of iron, particularly men, donate blood. If you got mutations in catalase, take some catalase. If you don't make your glutathione properly, support that. If you don't recycle your glutathione, work on that pathway. So again, we're not looking at a disease or treating a disease, we're supporting the function. Okay. Now let's move on to the next one, nitric oxide. If you Google nitric oxide Nobel Prize, you'll see that there was a Nobel Prize given for the research into nitric oxide. It's a gas that's a vasodilator. Okay. And low nitric oxide is going to relate to things like hypertension and other inflammatory conditions. Um, Lack of nitric oxide is related to erectile dysfunction in men. And of course, I'm sure people have heard about people who carry nitroglycerin with them. If they start getting angina, they put that drug under their tongue. It increases the nitric oxide, and then the angina gets better. So, one of the interesting things about nitric oxide is as we make it, if there's genetic mutations in the enzymes that don't make it, rather than making nitric oxide, it goes into superoxide. Then that superoxide combines with more nitric oxide and makes an oxidizing agent called peroxynitrite. Then that depletes something called BH4 that's needed to make nitric oxide. So many times when people have cold hands and feet or something called Raynaud's or cardiovascular, they are not making enough nitric oxide. So simple things, things like beets that are high in nitrates can do that, can help you that make more nitric oxide. Or there's actually things like pomegranate and hawthorn berries that can actually help the NOS enzyme. So it's interesting. We have things in nature that support that. So again, we're not talking about a disease. We're talking about function. And if you don't have those enzymes working properly, rather than making nitric oxide, you make superoxide. And by looking at the genome, you can see when there's mutations in those what are called nitric oxide synthase enzymes. Now let's talk about glutamate. Glutamate's a neurotransmitter that makes you intelligent, highly motivated, go-getter. These are the people that are like, school's easy, and they're always can be dependent upon. If there's a job to be done, they're there to get it done. Glutamate needs to turn into GABA. GABA is the don't worry, relax, chill. We need a balance between the two. And interestingly, even ethnically, there's some changes there. Like if you go to Switzerland, everything's neat and clean, and if the train is late by 15 seconds, people are having a fit. Go to the islands if you have an appointment at noontime. If you're there by 1 o'clock, what's the problem? You know. And again, neither is better or worse, but interestingly, in some of those cultures, there's high glutamate. Germans are high in glutamate. And if you look at Nobel Prize winners, 19th century, most were Germans. Okay. So glutamate makes you intelligent, highly motivated, go-getter. GABA is the don't worry, relax, be happy. Glutamate too high will make you anxious, make you very sensitive to bright lights and loud noise. Children with high glutamate, tags bother them. They're very sensitive, sometimes they're a little bit paranoid. If the glutamate goes too high, that's when you can get OCD, or you can actually become schizophrenic. I mean, there's a complex issue, but high glutamate plays a role in that. Or sometimes people with high glutamate will start seeing visual hallucinations. They think they see somebody in the corner, or they'll hear whispers. So there are genetic mutations that make high glutamate, and there's genetic mutations that impair the glutamate to GABA conversion. So mutations in DAO can make more glutamate. Mutations in GAD, GAD, can make the glutamate to GABA conversion difficult. And again, there's a couple simple herbs, something called hinokial, which comes from magnolia bark, supports the glutamate to GABA conversion. And now, interestingly, glutamate just doesn't make you anxious. It also stimulates inflammation inside the body.
So high glutamate seems to be associated with high anxiety or high stress. And so would that be, I guess this is probably multifactorial answer, but would a high amount of glutamate be due to an overproduction or an inability to, convert it to something else?
It can be both.
It can be both.
You can have mutations in a DAO enzyme that makes more glutamate, and you can have mutations in the GAD enzyme that doesn't turn glutamate into GABA. Now, glutamate's also quite interesting. It also turns into energy, succinyl-CoA. So you can actually even have mutations that you don't turn glutamate into energy. Glutamate also is one of the cofactors for glutathione. So you can also have genetic mutations that the glutamate doesn't go into glutathione. And glutamate also goes into glutamine, an amino acid, and you can have issues there. Yeah, glutamate's very complex. And then unfortunately, what happens is, a lot of people uh, think, well, I'm going to improve my health. I'm going to do bone broth. And if you have
Hmm.
high glutamate, that can push it higher. Or they have a gut issue. So some well-meaning says, let's give you high doses of glutamine powder to heal your gut. Well, if you already have too much of that, you can make things worse. Or collagens. So, one person's healing agent is another person's poison.
Wow.
Yeah. So I believe way too much glutamine is being consumed. Now, it does heal the gut, but it does so by stimulating growth of new cells. But that can be pro-inflammatory. So again, I think we've got to get away from the pill for the ill, or, you got a gut problem, take glutamine. Maybe. If you already have too much glutamate, you can be throwing fuel on the fire by actually doing bone broth and glutamine, thinking you're doing well, and you can actually make the problem worse.
As you said that, believe it or not, I was actually just sipping on bone broth right now. So,
Well, and that might be fine for you. Yeah,
right, right.
that might be fine for you. If you don't have a glutamate issue and you don't have a histamine issue, that can be just fine. So that's a good segue. Let's talk about bone broth. It's high in glutamine and histamine. Now, allergies, boom, just through the roof. So people are swallowing antihistamines by the bucket load. So histamine is not bad. We need it. It's part of our protective mechanism. It actually, at the right levels, can help you sleep. But in excess, histamine will actually drive inflammation. So that's why people get the runny nose, the itchy eyes, the sinus congestion. But histamine can also affect the skin. Oftentimes people tell me, well, I don't have any allergies, so I don't have a histamine problem. But histamine can affect the cardiovascular system, can affect the gastrointestinal system. That's my own personal issue that I deal with. Histamine affects my gastrointestinal system. It can affect us in so many ways. So people take antihistamines, which block the receptor site. They work beautifully at suppressing the symptoms. Uh, but one of my questions is, well, if you block it from going into there, then where else does it go and what else does it do? So I believe one of the things we're seeing in our country right across the world is overproduction of histamine. And let's not go too deep in the woods, but there's an enzyme called NOx, NADPH oxidase, one of my favorite enzymes. Favorite from a standpoint, I think it's a problem. So when we are faced with a pathogen coming into our bodies, I mean, what an amazing immune system we have. The immune system says, you don't belong here, dude. Let me create some superoxide, mast cells, and histamine and take you out. If we didn't do that, life wouldn't exist. We'd be dying of infection. However, I believe environmental factors are overstimulating that NOx enzyme. And, when I talk to doctors who've been practicing more than 20 years, when I do my training for physicians, I'll say, okay, for those of you who practiced 20 years ago, how much mast cell activation did you see back then? It's like, we didn't. How much do you see now? Majority of people are coming in, this is not like the functional medicine doctors. The majority of the people have mast cell activation. So mast cells are white blood cells that protect us. They're our friends unless they're overactive. And we're just seeing so many people now with these mast cells being overactive, and it causes inflammation in the body, including creating histamine. And then there's multiple enzymes. We make something called diamine oxidase that degrades histamine. Some people have genetic mutations. They don't make enough of that. We have an enzyme called HNMT, histamine N-methyltransferase, that degrades histamine. Some people have mutations there. MAOA, MAOB. There's what are called the UGT enzymes that do something called glucuronidation, a phase 2 detox. Sometimes people have mutations there. They don't clear the histamine. That histamine, interestingly, then stimulates a cytokine called interleukin 6. And guess what it does? It makes more mast cells and more histamine. and you're on one cute little merry-go-round that just keeps spinning around. But then that IL-6 also makes more superoxide, more peroxynitrite. So so when we look at someone's functional genomics, we look at, are you not producing enough DAO? Is your HNMT enzyme not doing its job? Is your glucuronidation not doing its job? Then there's ways you can compensate for that.
And are
Now,
the approaches to limit histamine, high histamine foods and histamine producing foods? And is there
that
also a way
that can be a
to, yeah,
strategy, yeah.
okay,
Yeah. Yeah,
okay,
and unfortunately, there's some people that again think that this is good for everybody. So sometimes people will recommend uh, fermented foods to heal the gut, and the idea is that it supports the probiotics and the biome. Absolutely correct, unless you don't degrade the histamine. So I have seen so many individuals trying to get better by going on like a GAPS diet or something like that, and they made themselves worse. So again, we got to get back when somebody says this is the diet that's good for everybody, run, because there isn't one. so so for some people, they gain their health back by severely reducing high histamine foods. Now, if you have enough DAO and your histamine pathways are fine, go ahead. Enjoy your sauerkraut and kombucha and miso and all those kind of things, because it probably does help the gut. But if you're overproducing histamine, you don't make enough of the enzyme that degrades it, your detox pathways are not working, histamine foods is your worst enemy. So again, one person's medicine is another person's poison. So that's another area we need to look at, because high histamine will drive systemic inflammation throughout the entire body.
gotcha.
Now, this is probably something that nobody's heard of, and that is called the Heme Cycle. And that is where the body takes glycine, an amino acid, and they take succinose CoA from the Krebs cycle, and they go through 8 steps. And the bottom line is to set you up so that iron can go into your heme, for your hemoglobin. And heme is also responsible for many of your phase 1 detoxes. So if we have genetic mutations in any of those steps, what can easily happen is what are called porphyrins will block the GABA receptor sites, and these people are anxious as can be and inflamed. And these are people who get hangry because they need a constant source of fuel. So these people just crave food and many times become alcoholics because they need that sugar to feed that pathway. And then finally, we want to talk about EMF and the NOx enzymes. Interestingly, there's a gene called calcium voltage channel gate, and what it does, it sits on the outside of your cells, and what it does, it regulates calcium going into the cells, which we need. It's stimulated by voltage. We are electrical beings. We that's why when somebody gets a severe case of diarrhea, you can have, especially children, you can wash out your electrolytes and you're in trouble. So we are electrical beings, and we do send an electrical signal to put calcium into the cell. When there's mutations on these calcium voltage channels, the gates allow too much calcium to come in. And make a long story short, it creates more superoxide, more peroxynitrite, and more inflammation. So these are the people that when they're around EMF, and I've spoken to many people, that they can tell when they're being exposed to EMF, they can feel it. And of course, they're many times condemned and criticized. You're crazy. This can't hurt you. This cell phone, well, that's nonsense, kind of stuff. But they actually do feel it. And then, sadly, despite the fact that they're sick, they're ridiculed for it. Or people that are exposed to mold, because mold stimulates inflammation. And they complain that, oh, I'm sick in this house. And it's like, it's nonsense. It's all in your head. You need to see a psychiatrist. So, uh, and I don't, I will admit there are some hypochondriacs, so I'm not dismissing them. But many of the people who do have reactions to these things, they really do. They're not making it up. One of my favorite sayings when I do health coaching consultations is, I have four important words for you, and that is it's not your fault. Because sometimes some people are, if they're anxious or they're depressed, it's like, well, just relax. And then sometimes in the religious community, it's like you're not praying hard enough. There must be sin in your life. Then the new age groups, it's like we are not intending it enough. You're not meditating hard enough. And all of those are good. I mean, prayer is great. Faith in God is great. Meditation is great. Fine. But if you've got high glutamate and you're not going to talk your way out of it.
Yeah,
So,
no, absolutely. I mean, I think what you're saying is spot on to what I've come to learn too. It can't just be, a mental thing. It's great if you're doing something like, I don't know, cognitive behavioral therapy, if that's what you need, but also working on the physiological piece. Because if your glutamate levels are high and you're trying to will yourself to not be anxious, I found that to me, that doesn't really work.
no, it doesn't. And then you beat yourself up. So then it's like, well, I guess I don't have enough willpower. I guess I
Right.
don't have enough faith. I guess I'm not a good meditator.
Yeah.
And then it's my fault. Well, if you've got high glutamate and high histamine, it's not your fault. You know, I make people laugh. I say, I wish I could give you a syringe of glutamate and histamine, shoot these in these people's butts, and say, now tell me about just willing yourself out of this. That always makes them laugh, and it makes them feel good. They're so thankful when they're told it's not your fault. Now, again, stress and anxiety. I'm not a psychiatrist. There's many, many causes. So I don't want to say that everybody who's stressed has high glutamate and high histamine. That would be, improper to say that.
Right.
There are many conditions. The cognitive therapy is helpful if somebody's had traumatic life events. But in some individuals, the anxiety is related to glutamate and histamine. And I've seen many people cut some of the high histamine foods, take a DAO enzyme, and they're a new person. Now, that's not the solution for everybody.
Right.
Again, we can't say this works for anxiety. We've got to have personalized care.
And so you achieve that by doing the testing.
Right. Look at the genome. Yes.
Right.
Mhm. Yeah.
Okay.
So I think
Amazing.
when I started out, it was like, you look in the book, oh, do this for arthritis, do this for that. And now I'm to the point of let's look at the person. And
Yeah.
and I think that's going to be the future. We're on the verge, I believe, of personalized care. I mean, we're just infancy of this. That we need to look at the person as an individual, not as a cookie cutter, do this for that.
Absolutely. I mean, it really comes down to bio-individuality. And I think stuff like the food pyramid, recommendations for everybody is something that we desperately should get away from.
Absolutely. Now, you ready to move into the antioxidants?
Yes. So to clarify, all of those things that you listed are things that either increase inflammation, they drive histamine, and they drive interleukin 6. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, perfect. Let's get into the antioxidants.
Let's get into the antioxidants. And there's something called NRF2, NRF2, nuclear transfactor anthroid 2. That's why they call it NRF2. And I'm fascinated by NRF2. So what happens is that I often give the analogy, think of a sprinkler in the system, in the ceiling. So if you have a sprinkler in the ceiling, there's a heat detector and there's a valve. And there's a water pipe behind that with water. And it sits there and does absolutely nothing unless there's a fire. And if a fire starts, the valve opens up and squirts out the water. Now, again, what a miracle the body is. We sense when there's high levels of inflammation. And something called keep one is kind of like the valve that's shut because it holds on to NRF2. And NRF2 sends a signal to all the genes that make, utilize, and recycle glutathione. It also is involved with the recyclers. It's also involved with glucose metabolism. It's involved with phase 1, 2, and 3 of detox. NRF2 is a central component. It balances autophagy and mTOR, the cleaning of the cells and the growth of the cells. And keep 1 holds on to nerve 2. So you can actually have genetic mutations in the keep 1 that actually makes the keep 1 stronger, meaning it holds on more tightly. So that when inflammation comes along, it's like inflammation, what inflammation? And it doesn't relieve the nerve 2 to go do its job. You can also have mutations in nerve 2, that the nerve 2 is not as robust. Just, Bob Miller observing, because I do functional health coaching 9 to 11 hours a day, 6 days a week. For people who have a lot of mutations in keep 1 and nerve 2, these are the folks that have unresolved inflammation that nothing is working. And interestingly, there are nutrients that will support nerve 2. Something called hepcidin. There's a product made from astragalus called paractin, milk thistle, turmeric. All of those push that nerve 2 a little bit to make it move its antioxidants. Studies have shown that the higher the nerve 2 in a mammal, the higher the average lifespan. So when you look at bats and rats, despite the fact that one crawls and one flies, they're very similar. But I believe the nerve 2 is stronger by a factor of 4 in the bats, and it lives about 4 times longer. So there's a
Wow.
direct linear relationship between nerve 2 activity of the animal and how long it lives.
So some people don't turn on nerve 2, so to speak, as well as others?
Yes,
Okay.
yes. And then if you combine that with mutations maybe in how you make glutathione, then that, again, it amplifies. So again, I think when we look at what is the SNP, like one of the things that drives me crazy is, oh my God, I got MTHFR, I need to take methylfolate.
Mm.
Maybe not. We can get into that. But we simplify things of, oh my gosh, I've got MTHFR, therefore I need to do this. And they feel great for around 10 days and then they crash.
Why does that occur?
Well, I'll tell you what, let me go move on to NADPH and then I'll come back to that. So one of my favorite subjects is NADPH. So what happens is when your glutathione becomes oxidized, it needs to be recycled. NADPH is what puts that electron on to recycle it. NADPH is needed to make nitric oxide. It's critical. And we can have genetic mutations like the G6PD that we spoke about, NQO1, that we don't make enough NADPH. Okay. Or this is a phrase that I've actually coined a couple of years ago, the NADPH steal. So what happens is the NOx enzyme that we spoke about earlier, that creates an inflammatory burst to kill the pathogen. Again, we didn't have that, life wouldn't exist. It's good unless it's in excess. Now, what's interesting, NADPH is what's used to recycle your glutathione, help you make your nitric oxide, do all these good things. But the NOx enzyme uses NADPH to make free radicals. So the same NADPH was an electron donor can recycle and knock down inflammation or be used to make inflammation. I found that quite fascinating. Bob Miller hypothesis only. Okay. I thought, why would nature do that? Now, here's just the Bob Miller hypothesis. So this in $3 will get you a cup of coffee. But I think when we have an infection, we want to have inflammation. We tend to think of inflammation as being bad. But when we have a pathogen to fight, we want those bullets to fly. We want to kill. So wouldn't it make sense that nature would have us that when the battle's going on, we slow down the antioxidant production? Because we want free radicals to kill. So we tend to be simplified. Antioxidants good, free radicals bad. Kind of. We need the free radicals to act as signals and to kill the pathogens. But if it's running too hot, that's when it does damage to us. You'll get a kick out of this. One of my favorite sayings is, I just told my staff this today. I said, if you really need to decide what the key to life should be, it's Goldilocks and the Three Bears. Not too hot, not too cold. Not too hard, not too soft. So we need free radicals to fight the battle. But if the army turns against the citizens, we have a problem. That's what autoimmune disease is.
Right.
So I believe that environmental factors are overstimulating the NOx enzyme excessively. And then what that does, that causes that NADPH to be stolen, the NADPH steal, so we don't have it for those other good things. Now, what we've been observing in our research is that those who have NOx enzymes upregulated, plus they don't make enough NADPH, these are the folks who have a lot of inflammation. So one of the things that's been very popular now, some of the folks are talking about NMN, nicotinamide mononucleotide, because it helps you make NAD. NAD is what balances growth versus cleaning. It helps feed what's called the PARP enzymes for DNA repair. It helps you make your antioxidants. So you would tend to think the more of this, the better. Let's take that NMN. Okay. However, if the NOx enzyme is upregulated, this is where taking NMN actually makes you worse. So again, 3D chess game played underwater. So I've spoken to many doctors who do NAD intravenous, and I've said, how many people are helped tremendously by this? Oh, it's great. How many people you really made them much worse? It's like, well, yeah, sorry, we did. So what can be, again, medicine for one person can be poison for another. The hypothesis, and it's only just that, and that is that if the NOx enzyme is upregulated, NAD can actually turn into more inflammation. Now, back to your question on folate. I don't know the exact mechanism, but this is published literature that if you don't have enough NADPH, folate actually becomes inflammatory. So you have all these people, oh my God, I've got MTHFR. They start taking 3 to 5 milligrams of folate, and they're actually throwing fuel on the fire. Now, clearly, if you're a pregnant woman, get on folate this afternoon because you need that to stimulate mTOR for the health of the baby. But excessively stimulating it can be a problem. So again, Goldilocks and the three bears. Methylfolate stimulates mTOR, the growth of new cells. Do we need that? Of course we do. But if we push it too hard, then we're going to weaken our autophagy. Which is
mTOR, if I'm not mistaken, is that the upregulation of mTOR correlates with cancer?
Yes.
Right.
Well, mTOR doesn't cause cancer, but mTOR is the growth of new cells.
Right.
So it stands for mammalian target of rapamycin. If we didn't have that, the sperm and the egg would never become the baby never become the adult, we'd never make new cells. Critical for life. The inverse of that is autophagy, the cleaning of the cells. And so we need to clean our cells as well, take out the old dead cell, because your cells are constantly dividing. That old cell has to be taken out. And that's why when people get older, they get age spots, sunspots, liver spots. That is dead cells that are not cleared out. They become senescent, and then they become actually inflammatory. So it's very important that we have that balance. Goldilocks and the three bears. We need autophagy to make new cells. We need autophagy to clean the cells. They need to be in balance. One of my studies on Lyme disease showed that those with chronic Lyme had genetic and environmental factors that put that out of balance. Excessive mTOR, insufficient autophagy. So back to the, back now to the mTOR, your question. mTOR replicates cells. It doesn't care whether it's a healthy cell, cancer cell, or even COVID. It replicates it. So excessive mTOR won't cause cancer, but if you have cancer, it may stimulate the growth of them. Even pharmaceutically, they're looking at ways to slow down mTOR as a treatment for cancer.
Wow. So the biggest point that I think you're emphasizing is balance, right? We want balance of growth or mTOR and autophagy and, cleaning. We also want the balance of antioxidants and oxidation.
Yes, it all comes down to balance.
Okay.
A good example is homocysteine. The higher the homocysteine goes, the sooner you die from all causes. But we need homocysteine to make glutathione.
Mm.
So if we don't have any homocysteine at all, we don't make glutathione. So there's a balance. I mean, another good example is oxygen. Cut off somebody's oxygen supply, they've got 3 to 5 minutes. Breathe pure oxygen every day, you'll oxidize and probably die in a couple of days. Water. That water, you got 7, 8 days before you die. Drink 4 gallons a day, you'll wash out your electrolytes and your heart will stop.
Wow. Yeah.
So balance to everything.
Absolutely. So
And
in terms of the, yeah, no, go
I was
ahead.
going to say that the Chinese got that right with the yin and the yang.
Right.
You can be too yin or too yang, and it's the balance between the two. I mean, some of those ancient ways of looking at things were brilliant. I mean, the Chinese medicine of yin and yang was like, wow, it's really
It's
the way the body
amazing.
works. Yeah.
It's amazing what they could do with, without the technology that we have. They understood these overarching, concepts and themes like balance. Amazing. So now I want to talk to you about a little bit more about the nutrition side of things. So I know we talked about histamine, we talked about some inflammation. Let's talk about a little bit about plant foods and some plant foods that could, be problematic. So are there genetic mutations that could make certain foods like gluten, dairy, anti-nutrients like oxalates a
Mm-hmm.
problem?
Sure. Yeah. Well, let's talk about gluten first. It's in what's in wheat, barley, and rye. And for the most part, think of the word glue. That's why when you get gluten-free, they're crumbly. Okay. Gluten by itself is somewhat inflammatory. But if you've got good gut health and all, you can handle the gluten just fine. But there are genes called the KIAA1109s that really predisposition someone to gluten intolerance. And of course, the severe form is celiac disease. So it's usually double mutations on the KIAA that make someone susceptible to celiac. And then, of course, what we're doing is some people believe that we're making the gluten problem worse by glyphosate. And unfortunately, they used to put glyphosate on the soil in the beginning. Now some people cut the wheat, spray it with glyphosate so it dries faster. So we're getting exposed to more glyphosate. Again, someday we're going to look back and say, oops. Yeah. Let's talk about oxalates. I can't tell you how many people I've talked to who weren't feeling well, and they decided, I'm going to get my act together. I'm going to eat healthy. So let's get rid of the junk food. And what could be more healthier than spinach, kale, beets? I'm on a health binge now. I'm going to get real healthy. And then all of a sudden they're getting worse. They're making smoothies with their spinach, kale, and beets. And it's like, what the heck? I'm eating healthier and I'm getting worse. Okay. So if you take those 3, spinach, kale, and beets, and you look at them under a microscope, you will see there's like little razor blades. They're called oxalates. Okay. And if your gut is doing okay, they just go right through the gut, no problem. And we think from an evolutionary standpoint, um, if bugs tried to eat them, insects, it killed the insects because it just ripped up their intestinal tract. So the plants that had more oxalates survived. It's amazing, survival of the fittest, and it's fascinating. So these plants that had the oxalates survived, so they're the ones that kept going. So if your gut is doing okay, you do fine on those oxalates. But if you've got a gluten problem or a histamine problem, or you get what's called a leaky gut, so there's what are called tight junctions on the gut. And if they start opening up just a little bit, okay, those oxalates can leak through. So for some people, a massage is just a wonderful thing. For others, it's like, oh my gosh, no, it hurts. Because when those oxalates are in the skin and you get a massage, it's like, ouch, that hurts. Or somebody just gives them a big hug or, plays around and grabs them on the arm. It's like, ouch, that hurts. And it's like, oh, come on, that can't be. Or, pain with urination. So unfortunately, their quest for health backfired on them. Now, again, I'm not against spinach, kale, and beets. They're wonderful foods. But if you eat too much of them and have a leaky gut, it can actually create a problem. And sadly, oxalates stimulate interleukin 6, one of the major inflammatory markers inside the body. Now, genetics will never tell you whether you have an oxalate problem. You've got to do like a Great Plains urine organic acid test to see if you have oxalates. But there are genetic predispositions that if you get oxalates in the body, you don't degrade them as well. So functional genomics is never a diagnosis. It doesn't tell you where you're at or where you're going to be. It gives potential. So if somebody has a lot of genomic mutations on their oxalate degradation, it looks like they've got a gluten problem and a histamine problem, you would likely be high on the potential to have high oxalates. But again, you have to do lab work to see it. But if you're very sensitive to touch, if you have pain with urination that's not a urinary tract infection, there's a good chance oxalates are wreaking havoc. So very sad that somebody tries to make themselves healthy and they make themselves worse.
Absolutely. I think that's one of the problems with, I think in the past decade, the vegan diet has become very popular. That's probably one of the problems with it, because I think there are probably a lot of people now with, leaky gut or intestinal permeability. And, if they're over consuming plant foods, they're getting, lectins, they're getting oxalates, they're getting all of these things that you're talking about that could potentially disrupt their health and actually make them worse.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And let's talk about dairy. You know, um, one of my favorite jokes is milk is the absolute perfect food to take a baby calf into a cow. Uh, and we are the only mammal that drinks the milk of another mammal. And I'm not anti-dairy by any stretch. But what we have to be careful of is that dairy does contain some of those growth factors that can stimulate mTOR, because that's what it's for, to support growth. But as we know, milk has lactase in it, lactose rather, and we make an enzyme called lactase that degrades the milk. Now, interestingly, there's a genetic mutation that keeps the lactase enzyme turned on. So again, we tend to think this was an evolutionary during times of famine. People who had that survived on milk. So you can actually see when you have a genetic mutation that's not the normal one, that's the one that keeps the lactase production turned on, because the lactase was designed to be on for a couple of years and then shut off. So when the baby weaned from mother, it didn't need it anymore. So, I mean, what a miracle the body is. It's astonishing. So we have the ability to digest the milk while a baby, and then it shuts off, and there's genetic mutations that keep that turned on. So if that stays turned on, then your body's producing the enzyme that can degrade the milk. Now, there's issues with proteins and other things in dairy just beyond that. But that's an interesting one. We look at that when we do a genetic analysis, that if people do not have the mutation, what they should do if they want to do dairy is like do a lactate, before the dairy.
Okay. And then how prevalent are, some of these dairy intolerances?
Uh, Again, I guess my database is skewed. I do see a lot of people of Northern European descent. And that mutation is very common, making them able to handle the dairy. But I do see it.
Okay.
That the lack of mutation, interestingly, is what makes you intolerant to dairy, or less able to break it down. Now, again, if you've got a healthy gut and you don't have any other problems, even without that, you can probably handle dairy okay. But if you've got an already compromised gut, then you do dairy when you don't break it down. The bloating, gas, those kind of things occur with the milk.
Right. Now, I want to move into another potentially problematic thing. I know we only have around 12 minutes left. So another problem with, the vegan diet, I don't mean to trash the vegan diet. I think there are certainly ways that you could probably make it as nutritious and nutrient dense as possible. But um, there could be problems with people converting, vitamin A, let's say in sweet potatoes, is different than the vitamin A that you find in liver or egg yolks or animal foods. So how does that play into
Sure,
nutrition?
absolutely. There's a gene called BCMO1, and what that does, that takes your beta carotene, like in carrots, and turns it in the active form of retinol, vitamin A. And you know where I'm going. You can have mutations here that beta carotene to vitamin A is not as robust. So when I consult with physicians, if I see their patient has a lot of those mutations, I say, you know what? Measure your beta carotene and vitamin A. Because sometimes, despite the mutations, it still works anyway. So genetic mutations is a potential. Now, vitamin A is not only needed for the immune system, but it's also needed for proper use of iron. So if somebody doesn't have enough vitamin A, their iron can be problematic as well. Uh,
Interesting.
so I don't know if you've ever seen anybody who becomes a health nut and they decide, I'm going to drink a lot of carrot juice. And they have 6 or 8 glasses of carrot juice and they turn orange. These are the people that don't convert their beta carotene to vitamin A. So they thought they were doing good. And I don't know if there's any serious problem with having too high a beta carotene, but we see it sometimes. I'll ask the doctor, I'll say, you know what, check their beta carotene and vitamin A. And many times they're high in beta carotene, low in vitamin A.
Interesting. Okay. And are there other micronutrients, any other vitamins and minerals that could be a problem?
Yeah, the one that I'm really fascinated with, well, there's a couple. One is B6,
Okay.
and you know B6 is critical. But back to Goldilocks and the Three Bears, B6 can be too high, and if B6 is too high, it can create all kinds of inflammation. There actually is a gene called NBPF3 that degrades B6, and when people have mutations in that, they're not degrading their B6, and then that B6 oftentimes creates inflammation. One of my theories is there's an enzyme called histidine decarboxylase that turns histidine, an amino acid, into histamine. If you've got an upregulation of that and too much B6, these people's histamine is through the roof because they've got high B6, they've got high blood histamine because they're making too much. So again, you know, I've seen people that they think they're doing good by taking a B complex, and if it's 50 or 100 milligrams of B6 and they don't degrade it, their B6 is through the roof. Now, I'm very intrigued by a riboflavin, B2. Riboflavin makes something called FAD. FAD is a cofactor that works with the GSR enzyme to take oxidized glutathione back to reduced. And if we don't have enough riboflavin, I don't care what your GSR is, I don't care what your NADPH is, you're not going to take it back. And that's one of the important things I'd like to make known. People are concerned about genetic mutations, and that's relevant. But you can have a perfectly working enzyme, and if you don't have the cofactor, it's like having a brand new car without gasoline.
Mm.
It's a hunk of metal sitting there. And so if you don't have enough riboflavin, you could have perfect GSR, you could have perfect NADPH, you could have perfect NRF2. It's not happening. And the same way with histamine and methyltransferase. We need something called SAMe. So you could have no mutations on HNMT, but if you don't have that cofactor, you're not going to degrade your histamine. So yes, we have to look at the genome, we have to look at the variants, but it's much more complex. It's the cofactors. So riboflavin makes something called FAD, which is the cofactor to take oxidized glutathione back to reduced, and also the cofactor for the MAOA enzyme, MAOA enzyme to degrade histamine. So if you don't have enough riboflavin, you're going to be inflamed, you're going to create histamine, and you're not going to degrade the histamine, and it could be just a riboflavin problem. So that's why I think it's important to look at the riboflavin transporters. And what I've seen is when people have mutations in riboflavin transporters and they're having all kinds of inflammation and histamine problems, B2 could be the answer. Now, I'm not saying B2 is the solution for high histamine and inflammation. I'm saying for those who have that genetic issue and FAD deficiencies, the problem.
Certain contexts.
Yes. So that's, and then also thiamine, B1 thiamine also calms down what's called interleukin 6 and mutations there. And then the final one, there's a solute carrier for acetyl-L-carnitine. And acetyl-L-carnitine helps take the fats into the cells for being used. And if you've got mutations in that enzyme, many times fats just become oxidized. So again, there's people that say, oh, we need the good fats. We need the good fats. Well, that's great. But if you don't carry those fats in, or you don't make enough phosphatidylcholine or choline, those fats oxidize. So again, everyone is unique. So when everybody says, eat a high fat diet and you're going to be healthy, I mean, the good fats, not the bad fats, maybe. For those who say, eat an all plant diet and you're going to be healthy, maybe. Okay. So it all depends on the individual. And that's one of the things that I'd like to do with the Nutrigenic Research Institute over the coming years. We want to work on creating nutrigenomic panels that people can look at so that you can even maybe, we'd like to someday be able to customize a multivitamin for you.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, that this is your multivitamin. You might need more molybdenum because your SUOX enzyme's not turning your sulfites into sulfates. You may not need nearly as much B6 because you may not degrade it. So it's going to be years until we're there, but we'd like to work with some universities and others so that we can put your genome in and say, okay, so a compounding is going to make a multivitamin for you. For example, if somebody overabsorbs iron, the last thing you want to do is give them iron. Okay.
Right.
If somebody's got too much glutamate, the last thing you want to do is give them glutamine. And if somebody's got mutations in the NOS enzyme, the last thing you want to do is give them L-arginine because that's just going to make more inflammation. So it's interesting in my health coaching, many times, I often say I think I help people the most by taking them off things. Because many times people are like, oh my gosh, I've been shooting myself in the foot. I'm taking all this glutamine, I'm taking methylfolate, I'm taking arginine for my nitric oxide, and they're just pouring gas on the fire.
Wow. So something that could be potentially helpful for one person could be highly inflammatory for another person.
Absolutely. And how many guys, want to improve their erectile function or muscle mass by taking L-arginine because it builds nitric oxide?
Many.
However, if you've got not enough BH4, not enough NADPH, mutations in NOS, you make superoxide and deplete your nitric oxide. Hate when that happens. Yeah, but you can actually make the situation, same with glutathione. If you don't take your oxidized glutathione back to the reduced, and I hear this all the time, glutathione does one spin, but then gets stuck and oxidized and actually creates more inflammation and reduces your glutathione. I mean, how ironic is that taking glutathione could make you more inflamed and reduce your glutathione? I mean, that just seems like that's not possible. But if you don't take that oxidized back to the reduced, that's exactly what you do. NMN, nicotinamide mononucleotide. Oh my gosh, look at all this stuff it does. If NOx is upregulated, you just made more inflammation.
Oh,
Very, very
wow.
complex situation.
Yeah, no, this is amazing. I know we don't have very much time here, so I would like to get into some of the quick rapid fire rounds that we get into at the end. I feel like I have a dozen more questions to ask you, and hopefully in the near future, maybe I can have you back on again.
I'll
But
be honored, yes.
so number one, what is the most important habit that you personally do every day to support your health?
Oh, I drink hydrogen water.
I recently started doing that actually. Yeah.
Yeah, the real quick on that is water is H2O. And there's tablets that you can get that are just made out of various forms of magnesium. You drop it in, it knocks the hydrogen loose, and then you drink it very quickly. So you're not even taking a supplement. You're just knocking the hydrogen loose from the water. It neutralizes the free radicals and helps stimulate your glutathione, SOD, and catalase.
Awesome. Number two, what is the most important lesson that you've learned recently, whether it be a life lesson, a paper you read, or any book you've read?
Well, and that is, I guess, what I said before, and that is there is no pill for the ill, that we've got to be personalized. So for one person, L-arginine is going to make nitric oxide. For another person, nitric oxide is going to make more inflammation. For one person, glutathione is going to be the cure they were looking for. For another person, glutathione makes them sick. So my life lesson is we've got to get away from do this for that.
Finally, what advice would you give to your 20-year-old self?
Be cautious of cell phones. And this isn't as much related to nutrition, but that is watch out for the narcissists. Because there's, as you can tell, I'm an empathetic person. And unfortunately, there's narcissists in the world who just love empaths and love to take advantage of them. So there's actually a genetic pattern that makes someone empathetic. And I've had many people tell me, Bob, that is the most important thing I've ever heard. And that is when you're an empathetic person, those who are narcissists, who just look out for themselves, they love empaths. And they know how to convince them that, it'd be like, oh my gosh, you're the most wonderful person. We're going to do great things together. They befriend you. They're masters of manipulation. Then they start manipulating you, trying to get you to do what you want to do. And then when you don't, they play with your brain and make you crazy. So one of my favorite things when I talk to young girls with their parents, like a 12, 13-year-old girl with their parents, and I'll say, now the old man's got a very important word for you to learn. Do you think you know what that word is? And they'll usually say, no. And I'll say, yeah, that's correct. That watch out for the empaths because they will ruin your life. So when a narcissist enters your life, run. So if I could have told my 20-year-old that when a narcissist tries to convince you that they're going to be the best friend you ever had and going to help you, run.
I think that's probably one of the most unique answers I've gotten to that question.
Yeah. Yeah. And many people they've actually called me and said, Bob, in your whole conference, your 3-day conference, that was profound. Because many people in the health field are empathetic and they let people take advantage of them.
Amazing. Thank you for your time. I really appreciate you, spending an hour and a half here. You're incredibly knowledgeable, and this is going to be super valuable to everyone I know.
Well, very good. And hope people found some pearls in there that helps improve their lives.
Oh, before I forget, where can people find you?
Oh, our website for doctors, if you're a health professional, you can just go to dnasupplementation.com. And if you're a health professional, you can use our software, only health professionals only. We don't work with the public. And we have online certification courses. And if someone wants to find our office for health coaching, tolhealth.com. It stands for Tree of Life, tolhealth.com.
Amazing. Thank you again.
All right, my pleasure. Have a great rest of your day.